Hello and welcome. You're listening to CIH Futures Guide to the Housing Sector. Futures is the Chartered Institute of Housing's network for young professionals in the housing sector. In this podcast series, we introduce and explore key topics and issues facing the sector today and how you can get involved. To find out more about Futures and what the CIH can do for you, you can visit cih.org.
So it's National Inclusion Week in September, and to mark the occasion, CIH Futures Northern Ireland decided to record a podcast. So we really hope you enjoy listening to the conversation today. But I want to set the scene a little bit and tell you why it was important to address this in September. So what's the aim of a podcast? Well, it's actually to spark conversations and inspire thinking, generate ideas and discuss new initiatives, and obviously around inclusion. And we really want to engage all communities. So with this method and using this platform, we hope this gives people an opportunity to have a listen on their way to work, on their way home from work, on that quick lunch break. So thanks for joining us. So we're going to delve into the topic of equality, diversity and inclusion, also known as EDI. With National Inclusion Week coming up, it's a powerful opportunity for your people to bring your people together and celebrate the diversity of your workforce and champion inclusion across your organisation. This year, the hashtag for National Inclusion Week is Now is the Time. And we want to be mindful of that as we move through the conversation. A little bit more about National Inclusion Week. It was founded in 2013 by Inclusive Employers, and it's now a yearly event that takes place in September, and it's dedicated to celebrating inclusion and taking action to build more inclusive workplaces. National Inclusion Week offers an opportunity to spark conversations, inspire thinking about inclusion across your whole organisation, and it serves as a platform for discussion, generating ideas or launching new initiatives, some of which you'll hopefully hear today. What makes National Inclusion Week unique and exciting is that it can involve absolutely everyone. It's a great week to discuss intersectional issues and include all your communities. So now I want to introduce our speakers instead of having to listen to me for another few minutes. So joining us today from CIH Futures Northern Ireland is Ashley Leach. Ashley's a housing advisor with the temporary accommodation team with the Northern Ireland Housing Executive. We've also got Christopher Donnelly, who's a housing officer with Clanmill Housing Association. And we're also joined by Conor Curran, Head of Diversity, Inclusion and Wellbeing at Queen's University Belfast, an EDI consultant with Kirko Consult. So I'm going to come around everybody now and I'm going to ask you the same question. Why was it important for you guys to join us today and have a chat about ED&I? So Ashley, I'm going to come to you first.
Yes, thank you, Julie. And I'm just really excited just for being able to participate in this. And I just think it's so important, especially as the hashtag says, now is the time. And during this current moment that we have, I think just addressing these issues just with so much division in this world is really important. And for myself personally, being the only female person of color in my office, I just feel like I have a responsibility to do more and be represented. So like the hashtag says, now is the time.
Now is the time. Ashley, thank you. I mean, we'll obviously have listeners, from Northern Ireland, hopefully from Scotland, England, Wales. This crosses across everybody. But we know locally, and especially in the housing sector, this is really prevalent at the minute. So like what you just said, now is the time. Christopher, I'm going to come to you. So why was it important for you to join us on the podcast?
Yeah, so for me, being a part of the podcast was really important because I think young people in housing, as well as being part of CIH Futures, it's really important to push talking about national inclusion and EDI, as you have touched upon. And it's important for me to be a part of the podcast during the National Inclusion Week, because housing to me is more than just bricks and mortar. It is about the people who are working within the housing organisations and all the other organisations that are involved in helping us be a success every day. It's about the communities and belonging as well. Yeah. And inclusion is central to that, because if the people aren't feeling seen and heard or represented, then housing can never truly be its purpose for providing safe and supportive homes, because that is our overall aim.
Yeah, and Christopher, you're right in that everything starts from home. We hear that saying so many times as well, don't we?
Yeah, no, 100%, Julie. Yeah, we really do. And it's just letting it lets us recognise people that are, sorry, I'm bluffing here.
Don't worry. Listen, do you know, if we will no doubt touch base on some of your points as we move through the conversation, Christopher.
Yeah.
We can tell that you're really passionate about this and delighted that you're joining us today. And we'll come back to some of the things that I no doubt you want to explore further as we move through the conversation. Thank you, Connor. Going to come to you. I mean, you're not from the housing sector, but you're joining us today, hopefully, A, because you're passionate, but also because you have expertise in this. So yeah, why was it important for you to join us today?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Julie, so much for inviting me. Yeah, I'm passionate about EDI. I've made a career out of it. I've worked in this space for 25 years, largely in Northern Ireland. I've worked across different sectors, not housing, but I've worked across policing, justice, health and social care, and for the last 9 years I've been working at Queen's University Belfast. And I think, you know, it's my job, so I've kind of worked out how organisations can really grapple with what can be a tricky subject matter. But I think this year and this week in particular is really more important than previous years because, like, globally, there's a bit of a pushback against what the Americans call DEI, or diversity, equity and inclusion. And I think what we're seeing is a lot of headlines being grabbed around the world about DEI, you know, strategies and plans being taken out of organizations' priorities, largely in America, for political reasons. But actually what we're seeing in sort of Europe and Ireland is a real no, now is the time to double down on this, because actually our countries are changing, our politics are changing, and for organizations who are trying to do the right thing in this space, now is the time to really focus on making a real difference. So it's really important, you know, for me to share what expertise I've managed to get over the years and maybe give some learning to CIH on what they can take away from that.
Connie, you just touched on something there, and Christopher, you mentioned it as well, you know, communities, and as our communities change, then so do our, you know, our colleagues and our staff and our employees in our organisations. So, you know, now is the time to lift the lid on ED&I and have those conversations. Really excited that you haven't worked for the housing sector before, because we've got you first. So yeah, there could be many more conversations come from this. So we've obviously done a lot of prep ahead of this podcast. We took some time to consider the questions that we did want to work through today. We know that this is only like sort of the starting point for this conversation, and we won't get through half as much as what we need to talk about in 40 minutes. But yes, I'm going to come to one of our first questions, and I'm going to come to Christopher first. And I want you just to tell us about your experience in the housing sector so far, Christopher, and like, what does inclusion mean to you on a day-to-day basis?
So from my own experience within the housing sector, inclusion on a day-to-day basis means making sure that people feel listened to, respected and valued. It's about the little things. It's nothing major that you have to do. It's the wee small things that really make people feel included. And it's about that, not bypassing them as well. And whether they're colleagues that you're working alongside or tenants that you're supporting on a day-to-day basis, it's just making sure that everybody fully feels included in the conversation and decision-making processes. I've seen firsthand how important it is to give people the space to share their views, especially those who are not always those that don't feel confident to speak up. For me, inclusion is about noticing those moments and making sure that no one is left out in the conversation. And working in housing has shown me how diverse our communities really are. There's different genders, races, religions, sexual orientations, and people with different abilities and disabilities that I work with week in, week out, as I'm sure actually you experience that too within your role. So the diversity is a strength, but it also means people experience housing very differently. And I've learned that we feel like a simple process for one person can feel like a barrier for another. So whether that's accessing services or finding a home that meets that particular person's needs, or feeling safe and accepted within their community that they're living in, for me, inclusion is about recognising those differences and making sure we adapt so everybody has a fair chance within our society here in Northern Ireland. It also comes down to everyday courage. There have been times when I've had to challenge assumptions or point out where something isn't working for certain groups of people. It's not always easy to speak out, but I found that being willing to speak up helps create a culture where others will feel
Being
that
supported
they're
to
able to do the
understand.
same.
Christopher,
So
there's so much in that. I mean, you said at the start, it's really simple. And in
yeah,
some ways, it is. But then the more I'm listening to you talk, you think, goodness me, this is so complex. There's so many things to consider. But
mhm,
what, I'm thinking as you're talking is it's not an excuse to ignore it. It is then sitting down with maybe the support of experts and consultants to develop a really good plan and strategy. And not to, we'll come to Ashley in a second, but Connor, I just want to come to you quickly. I mean, Christopher has so much to say there on the topic, and it's
mhm,
amazing to know that there are people in organisations with you, like you, with that passion, but
mhm,
not to feel overwhelmed because it seems so heavy. But Connor, I'm just going to come to you, and hopefully you'll
mhm.
back me up and say how it can be. I don't want to say simple, but we can tackle it.
Yeah, no, and Christopher, what a brilliant spokesperson for EDI within your organization. And I know Ashley, because I've spoken to her before, will convey the same passion. But so the challenge for organizations is how do you take people like Christopher and Ashley and others who have this passion for EDI and raise that up to the leadership level? Because there's a few lessons I've learned over the years, Julie, about organizations that get this right. And there's for me there's 5 key things that a good organization gets right when it comes to EDI. And the first is leadership commitment. So
Yeah.
for me, inclusion, as someone who's head of diversity and inclusion at Queen's, it has to be modeled from the top. So if I'm not living the values that Christopher's talking about, it just becomes a poster on the wall. It doesn't become real. Secondly, organizations need a clear strategy. They need a clear EDI strategy. That creates what we call within organizations an accountability framework.
Yeah.
Okay, something that goes beyond words. So your policies are up to date, your targets are being hit,
And you're
you report,
monitoring it.
you're monitoring it, you're evaluating it, and you're putting it on your website, and you're telling people where your challenges are, whether it's in terms of sectarianism, immigration, asylum, disability. You're telling them where your gaps are, but what you're doing about it, and your willingness to be held accountable.
Mhm.
Christopher hit on the third bit, which is so important, and that's listening to lived experience. Okay,
Yeah.
so too often what I see are organizations, they roll out initiatives for people rather than with people. Okay, so if you can create a safe way for your not only your staff like Ashley and Christopher and yourself, but your service users to share their voices, their concerns, whether that's through focus groups or forums, and that will feed into your strategy, and that strategy becomes co-designed. And that's
Yeah.
really, really important. If you can co-design a strategy and action plan that your service users can see their feedback in,
And
then that
coming
becomes
alive.
credible. Yeah, and that comes
Mhm.
alive. And fourthly, education and awareness. Okay, so making sure that your staff are trained on unconscious bias, allyship, cultural competence, accessibility, not just as sheep dip one-off training sessions that they have to attend. It's like continuous learning about some of these topics, some of which can be really complicated. And
Mhm.
then finally, what I would say is, as an organization, if you focus on your systems as well as your people, and by that I mean your recruitment practices, your promotion practices, your flexible working policies, if
Yeah.
you bring in those modern, progressive, inclusive ways of working, you will recruit people like Ashley and Christopher who bring in that diversity of thought from that different generation, which then leads to richer conversations about EDI. So that for me as a leader is how organizations can take all this passion and create a really good place to work.
Connor, there's so much in that, and again, I'm sure we'll come back to some of those points as our conversation moves forward. I'm taking a few notes myself that I want to come back to as we go through. Thank you for that, Christopher. Really, really appreciate you setting the scene. Actually, we're going to come to you. A slightly different question, but just again to tap in a little bit more about those misconceptions that people have about diversity and inclusion, within our sector, within the housing sector, or broadly within society. So actually, yes, we're just going to come to you for that one.
Yeah, so it's really hard just to pick, I think, one misconception. the first thing that I really think is that once people are done with their training, then that's the job done. But inclusion is an ongoing commitment, not just a one-off. So it's about, as Connor said, changing behaviors and systems, and it's not just a tick box exercise. And I also think that within the housing sector, EDI initiatives, people might think that they only benefit minority groups, and it's therefore nice to have rather than essential. So it is just changing maybe that stigma within ourselves as well as the organization. I think that's very important.
And that's that education piece, isn't it? Again, that education and awareness piece. And I think what's all three actually of you have spoke about how it needs to be ongoing. And if we look at how much our communities locally in Northern Ireland has evolved and changed over the last number of years, that's why training that people maybe have done on this 5 years ago is so out of date and needs refreshed and needs to be ongoing. And our communities will continue to evolve and change. So what we do today is not going to be the same as next year. So, I mean, we all know, because we're keen and passionate and have a little bit of insight on this topic, how important that continuous education piece is. Thank you all for that. We want to now bring into life a bit of an example. And Christopher, when we were doing a lot of our prep, you had a really good example that lets us get our teeth into something now. So I'm going to come to you and ask you to share that experience and that example that you had, and just how it didn't actually fully consider everybody's perspectives.
Yeah, so I can recall times where a decision has been made to refurbish existing housing stock at schemes, and the decisions were largely based on the cost and the aesthetics of the particular buildings that I'm talking about. So things like step-free access, wider doorways or adapted bathrooms weren't given much thought. So because they were seen as extras rather than essentials, the cost would not cover that. So what happens later on down the line is that more money is actually going to end up being spent because those conversations aren't happening in the beginning with the customers, and and they're not being included in the processes that the organizations are actually making. And for subsequent to that, further down the line, the organization is going to end up spending more money. So it's a detriment to them. So I really think it's important from the get-go that everybody's included in those conversations, and what the adaptations is in the adaptation process. I know a lot of customers with disabilities will have physio recommendations and things like that, but as a physio making the recommendations, you had to be out with the customer, you had to be speaking with the customer face to face, you had to see what suits them, because it's not a one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to this. To these kind of adaptations that are being made, and it's not a small amount of money that's being spent, it's huge amounts of money. So if you get it right from the get-go, then it's better for everyone. So that's what I would say. But it's also it's important to include different perspectives on the decision-making stage. If tenants with lived experience of disability or staff who understand those needs have been consulted or included from the start, the outcome would have been more inclusive and potentially more cost-effective in the long run.
In the long run. So you said, I mean, I'm so fascinated already how we are talking about the same key important words that are coming out. You just said lived experience again. You said it earlier, and Connor's already referred to it. And that's not difficult. You guys work as frontline housing officers with your tenants. You can have those conversations and bring those back into the organisations. Connor, I'm going to come to you in a second. I mean, the housing sector very much now are focused on building homes for life, for many, many reasons. But, that's the right consideration when homes are being built. And are we maybe bypassing people with disabilities who are on a housing waiting list because a house could become available that meets their needs in terms of geographical location, but it doesn't meet their needs then in terms of their physical needs. And then as Christopher refers to, the costs that people are incurring to make those adaptations. So we do need to be considering it at planning and building stage, just like Christopher said. So Connor, I wanted to come to you now to just dig into that a little bit more and see what thoughts you have around how the education sector may be doing something that could transfer to the housing sector.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's I mean, if you look around Belfast city centre, I mean, obviously we're Queen's University, Belfast. Everyone knows, anyone from Northern Ireland or Ireland probably knows where we're based in South Belfast, top of Botanic Avenue. But if you look at the city centre, a large number of the cranes that are up at the minute are building student accommodation, right? So whether it's down towards the Yorkgate area or around Carrickhill, areas that are cheek by jowl with social housing, okay?
Yeah.
If you look at the size of the buildings that are going up, they're huge. You know, they're 20, 30 stories high. They're all very modern. If you walk around the ground floor, you'll see, you know, they're fully accessible. We have had to do a lot of thinking around our market, and our market largely for these types of accommodations are international students, okay? So these are young students, typically 18, 19, 20 years old, coming from around the world to Northern Ireland for the first time. We've had to think about heating. We've had to think about door width, like Christopher says, in terms of students with disabilities. We'd have to think about tactile surfaces and putting information in Braille. We've also had to think about students coming from around the world with different dietary considerations. So not everything's sausage rolls and coleslaw baps. We're thinking about vegan food, vegetarian food, halal food, kosher food. We're having to adapt to a much more diverse market and a diverse audience. And there's expectations from different generations as to what is standard. So, high-speed broadband is standard. They need to be streaming calls with families to feel that sense of connection with their family who is, a 12-hour flight away. If they don't feel connected to their family because their broadband speed isn't quick enough, they're not going to be happy living where they're living, and they're not going to want to stay in Belfast.
So all
of these considerations are what we call intersectional considerations. So you're looking at people's age, their people's nationality, people's language, people's disabilities, where they come from, how they want to connect with people. They're the same issues that you have with your tenants. So what I suppose the learning from us is that we don't always get it right, but if we can hard bake our thinking around equality, diversity and inclusion into the start of a process or a tendering process or an engineering process or an architectural process and build in inclusion into the fabric of our buildings, we don't have to retrofit. We don't have to then start spending more money, as Christopher says, on making them houses for life or apartments for life. They are already hard baked in. So I think
homes for life,
exactly, and I think that's where there's learning for both sectors.
Conor, thanks for that. Actually, I hope you don't mind. I'm going to just pick up on something Conor said there and come to you for a quick comment. Conor, obviously we're trying to compare and contrast two different sectors at the minute, and the housing sector don't, as standard, have to consider things like shared kitchen spaces, so things like that. However, actually, what I wanted to pick up on there is that what housing associations and the NIHE do fantastically well is all of that community engagement and tenant participation. So where the housing sector aren't necessarily considering some of those things when it comes to the building of their homes, they should really take away some of those considerations when it comes to designing the tenant engagement pieces, the community support things. So actually just wanted to come to you about that, because you'll know much better than me some of those takeaways that Conor's talked about that the housing sector could pick up on.
Yes, 100%. So I definitely think a lot of these initiatives can transfer over to the housing sector. I mean, we already have been doing it within the housing executive. It's just more, I think, how can we do this better? How can we actually listen to our service users and our tenants, just to create better outcomes for them? We have a lot of already like tenant support groups and community support groups, just to get their voices heard and help us, collect more data as well, to go forward and track, how we can allocate better and, prevent homelessness really in the long run. It is quite difficult still. Our waiting lists, especially for people with disabilities. And it's not just the physical disabilities, it's a lot of the hidden disabilities and people with learning needs. So that I think we're still learning to do, but I think we are trying to progress and just learn as we go forward, especially just listening to the customer's voice ultimately.
Yeah, and just to wrap that point up, that cross-sector learning, is so important. So to open up conversations with people outside of housing. Thank you both for that. Conor, you actually mentioned intersectional barriers, intersectional, and that term, I suppose, maybe isn't as often used as what it maybe should or could, just to change the way we frame conversations. So could I ask you just to go a little bit more on what that means? What does intersectional barriers mean? Or the flip side of that is, how can we support a less visible community? So just wanted to ask you to pick up on that point and talk a little bit more there.
Yeah, I suppose if you think about the word intersection, like it's an American word that really, for me, describes where two roads cross or two roads meet. Okay, so like almost like a crossroads, an intersection. So intersectionality, when we talk about it in the EDI world, talks about our different characteristics. Okay, so you can see me on screen, and I'm white. I'm of a certain age. I'm not going to tell you what, but I'm well into the second half of my life.
Our listeners can guess our ages.
Yeah, guess my age. And if you think it begins with a 4, you're wrong. So I'm white. I'm from a Roman Catholic background. I'm straight. I'm married. I have 2 kids. I'm probably not the kind of guy that you should expect to be working in EDI because. But that's my intersectional profile. So I'm a man, I'm a white man, I'm a man of a certain age, and I'm married. But that's my intersectional profile. So when we talk about intersectionality, it's about trying to encourage organizations to not think in silos. So a lot of our conversation here is maybe touched on disability, but if we merge disability and race and gender. A woman of a certain age who is from a particular background with disabilities will have very different needs from someone who's 20 years old and has dyslexia, but no other characteristics that maybe are visible. And there are, as Ashley said, there are hidden disabilities. So not everything is very obvious when you meet someone. If you were to meet my eldest daughter, for example, you would not know that she has dyslexia. You would not know that she has ADHD, but she does. So intersectionality is about, I suppose, taking that broad approach to not just an individual, but a community, and thinking about how do we make our housing sector, how do we make our university the most inclusive place, the most inclusive place to live, the most inclusive place to learn. And that for me is what intersectionality means. And sometimes it can sound like a word that can be thrown into conversation to confuse people. But actually, when you think about it and sort of get to grips with it, it can actually make a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I'm thinking as well, I mean, Christopher, you have said, and some of the points that you've made about the real importance of considering everybody as an individual. And I'm already thinking, gosh, Conor, you're if you map this out, like you said, like almost a visual, multiple roads, and there will be so many of those intersectional crossroads. But if housing organisations sit down and do that mapping exercise and consider every single one of those well, then you will talk about it. You will look for solutions to do that piece of all inclusive. And actually, if there's one miss, then flag it and then go again. Thank you for that, Conor. I think that just helps wrap that part of the conversation up. So we have talked a little bit about setting the scene and a little bit about people's experience in the past. Little bit of look into the future now. So Ashley and Christopher, as young professionals working in housing, what role do you believe your generation has in challenging those existing norms and driving forward the inclusion agenda in housing? Ashley, I'll just come to you first.
Yeah, so I think it's just, as young people, like, we can bring a fresh perspective, and we're not afraid, at least I feel I'm not afraid to ask those questions, how it's always been done. And for me, so that's challenging outdated norms, and also bridging voices. So we have the experience to gauge older colleagues who may be less familiar with EDI concepts. So while also amplifying our voices and the voice of younger people, especially younger tenants and the less visible groups, I think.
Yeah, no, thank you, Ashley. And again, it's, there are existing norms for reasons, but that's okay. It's just then about supporting people to, change those or think about it differently. Christopher, what about you?
Yeah, so as a young professional in housing, I feel the same way, that probably that Ashley feels as well. So I feel that our generation has a really important role to play in challenging the existing norms. Like, we have grown up in a time where conversations about gender, race, religion, LGBTQ plus community and disability and social mobility are much more open. And I think that gives us the courage to speak up when we see something that isn't inclusive. We don't just accept this is how it is. It's always been done. Instead, we just don't accept how it is. It's always been done instead, and we ask who might be left out, or how
Yeah.
can we make this work better for everyone so they're all feeling included. And for me personally, I see our role as bringing a fresh perspective and a new energy to the sector, but whilst also having that respect for those who've been in the sector for a longer period of time, because we can learn from those as well. But it's also about combining the experiences and with a willingness to challenge practices that might unintentionally exclude people. Because I sometimes feel that we don't see that we're excluding people.
Yeah.
It can just be done. You can bypass it and not think about it. Some things we're just so set in our ways.
Everybody's busy, everybody's busy getting on
Yeah.
with their day job. And I mean, unintended consequences is another term that's used quite
Yeah.
often. And that's what you're alluding to there, those unintended consequences that could come from excluding people. But then you also said something, again, taking it back to being very, and I say simple and I don't say it flippantly, but I say, you say it just like, it's about asking everybody.
Yeah.
It's just about including and asking and considering everybody, because everybody is unique and is different. We're going to come back round to Ashley now, and Christopher, back to you in a second about just just delving into that a little bit more. But if you've had a thought or have an idea on one practical action or behaviour change that you'd actually, you'd want every individual in your organisation to think about for that more inclusive environment, Ashley, what would you say?
I would say just be curious instead of critical. If we approached everyone or anyone to our services with curiosity rather than judgment, I think we just build a more inclusive culture, and also just modeling inclusive leadership as well. So I think because EDI is everyone's responsibility, so it's not just for HR or a policy function.
It's for everybody across the organisation. And again, you've mentioned something that Connor mentioned at the start about that leadership commitment, and it starts at the top. Christopher, what about you? What would be the one kind of practice or change you would ask people to display?
Yeah, so mine's just a simple one. So one common practice I'd encourage is just for all organisations to adopt an active listening approach. That just means paying attention to the voices that may not always be the loudest, whether that's a tenant sharing their concerns or a colleague in a meeting who has not spoken yet. Sometimes inclusion isn't about a big policy change, that as Connor discussed earlier, but it's about creating space in everyday moments where people feel safe and valued to contribute. And if we can all make that small shift to listen more deeply and include more voices, I believe it will have a big impact on how inclusive we are as an organisation and a sector as a whole.
Thanks for that, Christopher. And I mean, again, as we've worked through the prep for this, we talked about if, you were one of those leaders in charge, or you could design a new campaign or initiative to be launched in your organisation, what would that look like and why? And, it was actually quite interesting when both of you sent me back your separate responses, but they were quite similar. And as we've actually had this chat today, I mean, if we hadn't have prepared this is nearly exactly what we should be coming to a conclusion on. But actually, I'm going to come to you first. I want you to just tell listeners a little bit on the initiative or idea you would love to see your organisation take forward.
Yeah, so it's just, I think it would be like creating a storytelling campaign, where staff and tenants can share their personal experience and inclusion or exclusion. Just hearing the real stories, I think, is just one of the most powerful ways to shift attitudes and spark that empathy with others.
I love that. And do you know what I love most is actually it's really important to highlight good stories and success stories, like positive inclusion stories, but actually it's equally important about highlighting those exclusion instances, because like Christopher said, it might have been unintentionally, but we need to talk about that. We need to take learning from it. So I love that. Thank you, Ashley. And Christopher, what about you? You had a great idea as well about an initiative you would love to see come into your organisation.
Yeah, so the organisation I work in, we have a lot of panels where customers are involved, so we're very good at that. But one thing that we are missing, and probably a lot of organisations don't have, is a resident and colleague inclusion panel. But for me, my dream for that to happen would have to involve everybody being involved. So it means bringing customers together of different genders, ethnicities, faiths, religions, backgrounds, no matter what their identity is, disability, skin color, and what their faith is.
Yeah.
Like having everybody in that one conversation to discuss what they see might be different from what we all see. Everybody sees it at a different lens. So I think it would be fantastic to have inclusion panels like that.
Inclusion panels, and that would then allow those people that are part of those panels to do that storytelling piece that Ashley talked about.
Yeah.
Connor, before we move forward, I'm just going to come to you on like Christopher and Ashley's ideas. Have you seen anything like this in other sectors that you've worked with that have worked well?
Yeah. Over the last 25 years, in all of the sectors I've worked in, the organisations that have done it well have taken this approach. Do not underestimate the power of storytelling. Storytelling might just sound a bit wishy-washy and a bit fluffy, but actually, if you can meet people who have a lived experience of moving from a different country, coming from a war-torn area, we meet students from Syria, from Iraq, from Gaza, more recently over the last few years, who've had to learn through not having school by teaching themselves English on Google, by walking across countries, by leaving their families behind. If you can allow them to tell their story, and this applies to people who live in Northern Ireland too, their stories of struggle, of growing up in care, of not having access to education, not having access to a home. If you can listen to their lived experience, and take that away to reflect that back into what it is that you do. This is the most important point. When you leave a storytelling session or an inclusion panel, there have to be leaders in the room, there have to be managers in the room, and there has to be clear accountability for what happens next, because very often what I see is organizations that set up these kind of sessions but then don't do anything about it. Yeah. That leads to a breakdown in trust and confidence, and that leads to a culture where it feels that it's more tick box and it's not real. But if you have management there and if you have leadership there who say, no, we are going to build this into our plan for this year,
and strategies, and
we are going to communicate what we're doing, and we're going to market it, and we're going to speak to people, and we're actually going to turn up and go to these things and participate and not sit at the back of the room. That shows credible leadership. So it's not just about the Ashleys and the Christophers, that they are brilliant people and very passionate. It's also about the levels of management above them and above them too. It has to come from a whole organisation approach
and that proactive involvement. And and sometimes opening up a room for people to tell their story, is so difficult. And actually some people at the end of it, can be really overwhelmed by, my goodness, what can we do about this? But first of all, if somebody has been willing to share their story, as you rightly say, it's not just enough to say thank you and finish there. It may be challenging, it may be difficult, but the point is, go away and again, either utilise our network and our connections in Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland is a small place, and we don't have to stay insular within our own sector. We've talked a little bit about the learning from the education sector, but obviously with you and your role in Queen's. So, if there's a challenging situation that arises from some of these inclusive panels and storytelling opportunities, that's okay. But let's reach out to our colleagues across Northern Ireland and see what other better practices we can do to make change.
Absolutely, and not to labour the point, but I suppose in my spare time, through I do provide consultancy to organisations. Sometimes an organisation just needs to have the confidence to write that strategy, to write that action plan, and then they take it and run with it themselves, and it becomes a self-sustaining way of working. So, I know sometimes consultants get a bad name because, some people see them all as just about trying to earn more money, but actually a good consultant can really give you that arm's length objective approach based in data, based in evidence and research that can give your management the tool to go, do you know what, see, next year we're doing stuff in EDI and sustainability and community outreach. Let's nail this down. That can really help too.
Yeah, no, Connor, thank you for that. I'm now keeping an eye on time because, as we said at the start, we could talk about this topic for hours, and we probably have about 3 or 4 minutes, I think, by my clock, to try and get this wrapped up. So before we do come to closing it, Connor, I do want to come back to you, and you have touched on it even just in your last conversation there, but some of those real foundational steps that an organisation can take to just begin to build that truly inclusive environment. I mean, it's quite clear that this will not happen overnight. It's quite clear that this has to evolve constantly as well. So, you're putting a policy in place and saying that's it done isn't going to be enough. But yeah, if you've got some tips either from Queen's or your role as an EDI consultant that you can share with us about your experiences of working with organisations in Northern Ireland who really got it right, and maybe what they've done differently, and what our listeners and our organisations who are listening can take away and learn from them, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'll keep it fairly short and sweet, given that we're on a wee bit of time pressure, but I don't want to sound like a broken record, but leadership and cultural change is so important. Leaders set the tone in organisations. If they don't live the inclusion, the culture of an organisation won't change. So it's not about big speeches. It's not about who gets promoted and who's in the room and who turns up to the photograph. As Christopher said earlier, it's about everyday actions. And for me, the key message is that inclusion should be everyone's responsibility. And if CIH are serious about it, if it becomes part of everyone's job, it will. A rising tide will lift all boats. So, there's the possibility for CIH to really do good things here. Secondly, I think looking to the future, I think EDI there's 3 emerging areas where an organization can really look to make a big impact. One is intersectionality that we've talked about. If you start thinking about it through that lens, you can really make significant difference through small wins. Okay. Secondly is neurodiversity, and we are seeing a growing number of people coming through with complex conditions, ADHD, dyslexia, dyscalculia, also mental health conditions, stress, anxiety, depression, etc. They all impact on our discussions around EDI and well-being and our discussions around living and co-design. So that's really important too. And what I would say is the organizations that have done it well have used data or evidence. They've meshed that data in with the lived experience of people. Okay. And so creating that monitoring framework, that accountability framework using hard data, which your accountants will love and your chief financial officer will love, along with the lived experience, which your marketing, your communications, and your outreach people will bring in, is a great way of bringing this to life in a measurable way. So that's what I would say. Leadership, look to the future, but also use evidence and data to create an accountability framework that makes it make sense to the people who are maybe a bit unsure of why it makes sense.
And that brings everybody then in the organisation on that journey. Connor, thank you very much for that. I'm busy sitting down, I'm thinking, actually, Christopher, future leaders in the making, with your passion and your focus and your dedication to this topic. We want people in leadership roles in our sector here who are, across multiple issues that need to be addressed in our ever-changing societies. You mentioned it there, Connor, and you mentioned it way at the start how, education is a key part of this. And you said there about CIH. So CIH, with being that professional body for those who work in housing, I do want to direct some our listeners to some of the resources we do have on our website just before we bring the podcast to a close. If you visit our website, the easiest way to find the EDI resources is use the search box function, put in EDI, and what you'll find is there's a downloadable framework that you can take back to your organisations. You can have a look at it yourself. You can pass it up the chain of command. You can get people to reach out to CIH for more info. But what it says is Equality means that the housing sector is striving for a better balance in opportunities, resources, and decision-making processes for staff, customers, and communities. It's all about being more aware of and proactive about the diversity of customers, and that will ensure housing organisations provide the right services and meet the right needs and aspirations. And then inclusive, it's about a housing sector that acts transparently and fairly, builds good relationships and works collaboratively with tenants, partners, customers and communities to achieve better outcomes. Hopefully, that brings together a lot of the stuff we've been talking about today. But you can access a fantastic self-assessment tool via our website that gives you hints and tips on areas to improve on, and another one for your organisation to look at those EDI processes you have in place. So if any of our listeners want any more information on that, please reach out to CIH, and we can direct you to those. But to wrap up, some final thoughts today. Again, as part of our prep, we all kind of took a minute to think about a quote around ED&I and inclusivity that means something to us. And hopefully by finish on this today, it'll give our listeners something to think about. So I'm going to let our listeners know what mine is, what one that rang sort of true to me. And it's that diversity may be the hardest thing for society to live with, and perhaps the most dangerous thing for society to live without. I'm going to leave that with listeners. It took me a few reads to, grasp it, but I actually think that's really powerful for the way I can consider the importance of EDI. Ashley, I'm going to come to you now.
So my closing quote is, there's no greater disability in society than the inability to see a person as more.
Ashley, thank you for that. Christopher?
Yep, my closing quote was, inclusion isn't about inviting people in, it's about building a space where everyone already belongs.
It's amazing when you just switch the perception of something, isn't it? How you just see something totally different. Thank you, Christopher. And Connor?
I don't think I can beat any of these three. They're all much better than mine. I suppose for me, the future of EDI is about intersectionality. It's about co-design, and it's also about recognizing that well-being and inclusion go hand in hand.
Connor, thank you. All that remains for me to say, which hopefully is bang on time, is a huge thank you to Christopher and Ashley and Connor for joining us today for this podcast. We said at the start, this may be the first of many along this theme. We would love to hear from our listeners if they think that this would be something they'd like to know more about. But thank you for your time in preparing for this, for being very honest and sharing your experiences, for being brave and coming to join us today, and Connor for your expertise that I really hope the housing sector can listen to, learn from, and if they want more information, again, feel free to come to me and we can share details. So thank you very much, everybody.